Alright, hello. This video is entitled The Importance of the Damsel in Distress Archetype and in Defense of Video Games. There's been some controversy, apparently, I don't know how this happened to become a controversy, about video games as a genre of art and as a medium. Now, obviously, any free society knows, and anyone who's been involved in art knows, that art is really our only defense against fascism, because fascism always posits something as being essentially true for all human beings. There's one truth, and you orient with it or you don't. Whereas in art, you see this disparity, you see just how different people are and how they depict things. And it is therefore mysterious, it is not ideological, it is individuated, and it seems to be involved somewhat with what is called the other, something which is not stringently circumscribed by the limits of one comprehensive self, be it an individual self, such as an isolated being or person, or a collective self, which is what we get essentially with an ideology. Now, what's the problem, therefore, with video games? Well, the problem is that it's a medium, it's an artistic medium, and it is being put down as a medium as such. Now, as I pointed out, art is our only defense against fascism. It always rebels against fascism. It always refuses fascism. So obviously any attempt to make a restriction upon a form of art must always be essentially weak, because no one would voluntarily give up one's freedom and the sense of mystery that one's life has for a kind of fascistic state. So, what seems to be the grounds for attacking an artistic medium in a way as to totally dissolve it? Well, the argument is abuse of the medium. Now, of course, in any instance of freedom, where individuals are totally free and totally accountable, abusing a medium is a natural risk. But the art itself does not do any imminent harm. If we're to be held accountable, we must realize that how we respond to art is our own responsibility. And as A.W. Watts said, you cannot have a free society that is at the same time a nursery. Well, what's the attack against video games as they're being practiced right now? Well, the attack is that there's a damsel in distress archetype that keeps appearing in it, as it tends to appear in most forms of art over the course of human history, leading many scholars to believe that this is one of the oldest archetypes of human behavior that we've ever seen, and arguably the origin, therefore, of many of our ethical ideas. Now, there's a reason why this is fundamentally hypocritical, to attack video games using feminist ideology, because feminist ideology itself hinges upon the damsel in distress archetype. What it posits is that women are essentially an underrepresented, disadvantaged group, and therefore in order to defend their freedom and in order to defend them from the evils of this kind of ogreish patriarchy, men have to adopt a certain ethic. Now, obviously, if we lived in a kind of an anarchy where we didn't have any ethics, this would be a very dangerous thing to eliminate, because if there weren't something of the noble savage in all of us, if there weren't some kind of archetype that is part of our nature that leads us to behaving in a civil or human way, then any woman would stand pretty much no chance against any two men, no matter how strong she was, simply because of strength in numbers. And ostensibly, in such a society, as akin to the kind that predated agrarian society, women would be in a special disadvantage, because, as we still see to this day, statistically speaking, Many women tend towards introversion much more so than men do, and there are various evolutionary explanations for this. So, but imagine such a situation that you're a woman and you are attacked by two men in a state of total anarchy. Thankfully, there's a safeguard that you have in this situation uh, where you're just simply outnumbered because one of these men may choose to beat the other man's head in defense of you. And that's what the damsel in distress archetype is. Now consider in our current state of affairs, the same feminist ethic that I posited. Well, such an ethic cannot exist in such a situation where there is no archetype, because supposing you were talking to someone with no empathy and no moral conscience, the person would simply say, well, why should this ethic follow from these facts? Obviously, the reasoning itself would appear to be a non sequitur to someone who does not have that archetype of human behavior, which the damsel in distress archetype insists upon, which is chivalry. My third point is that essentially this archetype, even in civilized society, still plays a role unconsciously in many dreams, and we have to acknowledge it as an involuntary action, because when anyone becomes much too patriarchal, uh, uh, one response to this sort of egoism is on the part of the unconscious, and this has been documented by the Jungian psychologists very thoroughly. I have even noted in my life, encountering some men who are markedly macho, that they have dreams about what is called the anima, or their own repressed femininity. Um, Horrifying things like her having been raped by the devil or something. Well, this is obvious from the Jungian perspective that when a man becomes patriarchal, he represses that side of himself. And so the damsel in distress archetype, as it appears in art, begins to represent not something external, but something internal, a remnant of an older time in human history, which is used to symbolize in one's waking life the necessity of re-owning parts of oneself, re-owning those repressed feminine aspects of one's personality. So, as you can see in all three of my examples, either in ancient society or in current society or in individual psyche, the damsel in distress archetype, which is actually at the root of all feminist ideology, is essential to stopping patriarchy, and in this sense, the ideology which seeks to stifle it can merely be seen as an extension of patriarchy, and a reaction to it, yes, but by that same virtue, an extension of it. And it's essentially hypocritical, as is any power attitude. It is, through its attempts to control art, essentially patriarchal, as the Jungian analyst Marion Woodman defined patriarchy, not as something male, but as a corruption of something masculine, which means that any one of us, as a human being, can become guilty of it, and you have to acknowledge that. And it's also dangerous because ultimately, as I pointed out, this archetype is one of the things that the feminist movement stands upon. It's one of its legs, and if you were to eliminate this, then feminism itself would disappear. And a more optimistic person would say that this is that Hegelian synthesis, which would render the feminist movement no longer necessary because we would have finally attained equality. But realistically speaking, I think that we would simply topple into anarchy, and we'd be robbed of one of the few things that would even help us to deal with such a situation. So the damsel in distress archetype is one of our oldest archetypes for a reason, and whether you like it or not doesn't matter, because no one likes observing the psyche of the human being as it really is. The question is, can we find some cause for optimism in observing it? And I thoroughly believe that we can. But this kind of information is being limited and restricted by these kinds of oppressive and essentially patriarchal ideologies, such as, ironically, contemporary feminism. Now, as I pointed out, also, and as relating back to video games and art will always reflect your psyche. You cannot really understand art, and I've observed this for myself. Practically experimentally. Um, this is a question that I've dealt with for several years, and a question that remarkably few people that I've asked about have dealt with, no matter where I went. But you can't really see art uh, as it is in itself objectively. You're always going to see reflected in it an aspect of yourself. If you don't believe that, then you become guilty of the same kind of logocentricity, to use a deconstructionist term, that has made possible racist ideologies, sexist ideologies, and all forms of unjust discrimination in the course of the world. Because what we see in art isn't out there, it's projected onto it from our own psyches. It's always a part of the individual. So it's a strawman fallacy to blame the art itself for it. Now, how do I find evidence for this? Well, I've found evidence for this personally. I've tried talking to my friends who were studying art in one form or another. I would text them asking, must it always be a remote object? That is it a thing in itself? I've asked Buddhist monks about this. I've really gone thoroughly into this question. And ultimately, I stumbled upon the deconstructionist philosophy of Jacques Derrida, which says, essentially, there is no truth in the art. And that just resolved the issue for me. There are certain people who are philosophically minded, who just get nagged by these things. But a good deal of them don't. A good deal of people take it for granted that an art means a certain thing. But it's always a mirror for you. And don't break the mirror just because you don't like the reflection. I guess that's my conclusion for this. Video games are an emerging art form, and I think it's nothing short of